Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Monday live stream. Every Monday, we talk about some training issue that might be impacting you, especially with a fearful, reactive, or aggressive dog. This week, we are talking again about ways that your positive reinforcement training might be going awry. Last week, we talked about how if your dog is taking treats and you think you're doing things right, but you're still getting problem behavior. Um, could you have conflicting motivations where the dog is both interested in getting your food and interested in whatever the reinforcer is for the problem behavior? Today, we're going to look at another common reason why your dog may be responding to cues and taking food as a reinforcer and still growling, barking, lunging, whatever their reactive behavior or problem behavior is. Um, I'll be watching for comments as usual and answer as many questions as I can. But let's jump into the slides. Okay, and if you can, oops, sorry about that. Try to get this centered. Okay. If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up or a comment just so I know that the sound is okay and the video is okay. All right, so today, why treats aren't working? Are you accidentally rewarding bad behavior? And what does that mean? Okay, so this is the situation we're talking about. Your dog is taking treats. You'll remember a few weeks ago, and if you missed this, check out the blog that we talked about why your dog might not take treats in training and what to do about that. But now we're in this situation where, yep, your dog's taking treats in training or toys if that's what you're using for your reinforcer, and that's great. But you're still getting some aggressive or fearful behavior, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. So there are two common approaches to training dogs who have problem behaviors, especially ones that we think are related to fear or anxiety in some way. And those are to train an alternative behavior, alternative to the aggressive or fearful behavior in the same context as the problem behavior is currently occurring, or counter conditioning. Sorry, I'm going to try to move this window so I can see my comments. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Hi, Joanne. Nice to see you here from Canada. Awesome. Okay, so is anyone using either of these? If I'll just check the comments as I go, but I'm curious how many of you are trying to train some alternative behavior like a look at me, a hand touch, a let's go, and how many are trying to use counter conditioning? And if you don't know what that means, I'll get into it in a second. Okay, so accidentally reinforcing bad behavior. How does this happen? Well, let's look at a couple different ways it can happen. It can probably happen lots of ways, but what I would call the most common ways for that I see it happening in positive reinforcement training. Okay, first let's talk about what it looks like when training is going well. So, hopefully, if you are training an alternative behavior, you've already taught your dog to do it in an easy setting, like at home or something. And now you're starting to work around triggers. So when training's going well, you're out. Maybe you even have a setup so the trigger is appearing when you expect it to. That's kind of nice. But in any case, okay, there's a trigger. Good. Your dog does something as soon as they perceive the trigger. Um, and you probably don't have a lot of influence over this necessarily. So it might be they just look at it to see it. They just stand quietly looking at the trigger. But there is some behavior that happens here before we take any action. Now, if you're training an alternative behavior, this is usually when you will give your cue, say, look at me, or Uh-oh, someone said they can't see anything. Can anyone else, can you guys see the slides? It should be broadcasting the slides. I'm gonna keep an eye on the comments. But as far as I can tell, um, the slides should be broadcasting. Yeah, I can actually see it on Facebook right now. Okay. So so sorry about that, whoever can't see them, but if you could try refreshing your browser, and if that doesn't work, the recording will still be there for you to watch on the business page or in the Facebook group. So um, yeah, you won't be able to see the comments unless I click on them and make them appear over the slide, but I find that gets kind of messy. All right, thanks guys. So unless you're on Facebook, if someone's commenting in the group or on the business page and you're also there, you'll be able to see the comments in the same location that you are commenting. But I have a place where I can see everybody's comments. All right, sorry, back to our training going well. So, okay, we see the trigger, your dog does something, probably, hopefully just, orients toward the trigger, looks at it. This is normally when you would cue your alternative behavior if that's what you're using. So say I'm using a look at me. My dog turns her head toward the dog or person that's the trigger. And I say, Juno, and that's my cue. If all is going well, is what we're assuming in this slide, everything's going well. Then the dog will do the behavior that I asked for, hopefully. Just one sec. Sorry about that. Okay, so I cue the behavior. The dog does whatever behavior that I've been teaching. I give them food, which I'm hoping is a reinforcer. So that's everything going perfectly well, training my alternative behavior. Now, if instead of training an alternative behavior, I'm trying to do counter conditioning, after the dog orients toward the trigger, does something, looks at the trigger, they just get food. So my thought process here is, well, I'm trying to develop a positive association. So when the dog notices a trigger, I give them food. But notice there is a behavior here that precedes the food. Now, so in both these cases, you are hopefully and likely reinforcing some behavior with food. In the alternative behavior scenario, you may be reinforcing both the initial orienting behavior and then responding to your cue. And in the classical conditioning or counter conditioning example, there's a good chance you're reinforcing just that orienting behavior, whatever is that first behavior that happens. But that's fine, right? You're fine with your dog just looking at the trigger. You just don't want them barking and lunging. Okay, so what's the scenario when things go a little bit wrong? Okay, so here's our trigger again. But here's where things start to go down the wrong path. Instead of that just quiet orienting, maybe, to the trigger that we talked about in the last example, now that your dog barked or lunged or growled, they did one of those problem behaviors that we don't like. Now, a lot of times we'll still, because we don't want them to bark, lunge, or growl, we'll still cue that alternative behavior to get them to do something we like better. And maybe they'll do that behavior, and then we deliver our reinforcer. And if we're doing counter conditioning, technically when you do counter conditioning or classical conditioning, you're supposed to sort of ignore behavior. Behavior isn't taken into account in the training plan. So your dog, no matter what your dog does, looks at the trigger or barks and lunges, you still give food. So the reason why these two scenarios, whether you're doing the alternative behavior building or classical conditioning, can result in reinforcing bad behavior is that in both cases, this bad behavior I have kind of in the reddish brown circle, the barking or lunging, precedes food. So in both cases, barking is going to lead to food. So both of these could end up increasing that behavior you don't want. Now, I should point out, I used to not worry about this very much, and certainly I have tossed food many, many times to dogs who are barking and lunging, um, especially in a shelter environment, and had success with that. So, I don't want anyone to think that, I'm saying that classical conditioning doesn't work, or that, oh, if you ever give food after a behavior you don't like, that you're going to reinforce it. You don't know what got reinforced until later. And sometimes this works just fine. There were plenty of dogs who lunged and barked at me at the animal shelter when I passed by at first. And then when I started tossing treats to them, they stopped barking, even though I threw treats to them after they barked at me. So it's not a given that you'll end up reinforcing the bad behavior, but this video is for those of you who are having trouble. So if it's not working, if your training is working fine, you're probably not spending the time to watch this video. But if you are having trouble, this could be at the root of it. Okay, so in saying this in words instead of the little diagram, ways that you could accidentally reinforce bad behavior is giving treats after a reaction. Like if you're doing classical conditioning, you could, if you cue a new behavior after a reaction and then, give food, that could reinforce that initial reaction, the negative reaction. The worst case scenario is if, and this could happen if you're training where your dog is so-called over threshold a lot, where you're pretty much only or very preferentially either giving treats or cueing the alternative behavior after a reaction. Um, and I don't know if I'll have it ready before next week, but I have examples of myself making this mistake repeatedly with one of our dogs where, you know, things aren't set up well. And it's only after the dog does something that you have to, you have to react to it and call the dog away and try to do something about it. So, so these are some ways that things could go right. And like I said, it might not. You could give treats after a dog barks at you, and the next time they see you, they might just wag their tail. Um, and if that happens, that worked for you, and then you have to worry about it. But otherwise, but if you are having repeated problem behavior despite what you feel like is pretty consistent training, this could be part of the problem. All right, I see a bunch of questions, which is awesome. I'm gonna scroll through them after I get through these slides here. So one thing I'd recommend doing if you think this could be a problem, if you're like, oh yeah, I'm giving treats like after my dog reacts pretty regularly, or after my dog growls at somebody. One thing you can do, and you would only do this if it were safe, of course, is just keep doing what you're doing and keep track of how many instances of reactive or fearful or aggressive behavior you have, say, for a week. So get some tally and make it kind of a typical week, your normal walks or normal interactions. And then for the next week, say, okay, this week I'm going to stop whatever I was doing before, say giving treats after the reaction. Now I'm not going to give treats. I bet most of you, if you're walking, for instance, a reactive dog, and Michelle, this might answer your question. If they bark and lunge at something, you probably move them away and then maybe give treats after that. So one thing you could do to see if the food is a contributing factor is say, okay, this week, if my dog does react, I'm going to move away, but I'm not going to give food for, at least whatever, 20 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute after a reaction. And then count your reactive episodes and see if you see any decline over the week. This won't tell you for sure, but if you do see a decline, then that gives you a hint like, oh, okay, well, maybe something I'm doing with food could be supporting my reinforcing my dog's problem behavior. Okay, so getting into fixes, which is now in this sort of diagram to put it into perspective. Okay, so here's our problem, right? We have the trigger, dog does the problem. One way or the other, after the problem behavior, they're ending up getting food, and we think that could be reinforcing the problem behavior. Here, as Michelle, you mentioned, ideally, the best thing is to intervene right at the beginning of this sequence. Stay farther away from the trigger so you don't have the reaction in the first place. And I know that, especially those of you living in, say, urban environments, you're like, oh, thanks, great advice, but it's pretty hard to implement, right? But if you do have the luxury or can think of some creative ways to stay farther away, this is really the best thing to do because, well, one, it's less stressful for everyone if there's less barking and lunging, right? But, um, last week we talked about how often we think the reinforcer for fearful or aggressive behavior is getting distance from the trigger. Um, this thing I'm talking about today, where food has become a reinforcer for the reactive behavior or fearful behavior, that's not mutually exclusive. A behavior could have multiple reinforcers. So, say your dog barks and lunges and they're afraid of dogs, and then they turn to you for food. And also that dog goes away because that's what they do when they're out on walks. They don't just stick around and watch your dog bark at them. Um, so there could be both of those reinforcers happening at the same time for the same behavior. So if you go out and your dog reacts at to whatever their trigger is, and you say, okay, I'm not going to do food, I'm just going to move away. Unfortunately, the behavior still might be reinforced because moving away is also a reinforcer. And that's a reinforcer you can't really get rid of because you're not going to just stand there and be like, well, bark it out, just work yourself up. You're going to probably move away. Your dog's making a scene, right? Everyone's staring at you. And also the pedestrian or the dog walker who your dog is reacting to isn't going to stay there and wait for your dog to do something you like. They're going to keep moving. So this is one of the biggest reasons to stay farther away from triggers if there's any way you can do so. Because every time your dog reacts, there's a chance that that behavior is reinforced. All right. But say, okay, despite our best efforts, happens to all of us, you still end up with the problem behavior. Well, heck. Okay, so I was too close. My dog barked and lunged or growled at whoever. What I have to do something. So what should I do? So as I just mentioned, you have to move away probably from the trigger. You don't want your dog to try harder to get distance if that's not working. And if you're out on a walk, like I said, it's not going to work anyway. The person or the dog is going to keep moving away regardless. I think the best thing probably you can do in this situation, if you think food could be one of the reinforcers for your dog's problem behavior at this point, is to delay. Don't give them food right away. Just wait a while, get distance. You're going to have to anyway. And then try to reassess and figure out, okay, how can I avoid encounters that are that close in the future? So in each case, you're just delaying food. I wanted to kind of put this into context of what we talked about last week, which is where we have competing motivations, which you could have in the situation we're talking about today as well. So last week we talked about, well, a dog who does the sit or does the look at you, takes the treat, and still turns and barks and growls at something. One reason could be that there are two reinforcers in place, the food and getting the scary thing to go away, kind of superimposed on each other, and they're doing both behaviors to get both reinforcers. So we said, okay, well, how can we reduce motivation for that second reinforcer, the one that's reinforcing the reactive behavior or the fearful behavior, which is we think the reinforcer is getting distance. And we talked about increasing distance from the trigger, which we just talked about in the previous slide, decreasing intensity of the exposure to the trigger. So like how the trigger is moving, what direction the trigger is moving in. So if your dog is reactive to dogs, a dog running around is usually a little more upsetting or exciting than a dog standing still. A dog coming toward you is tougher for most dogs than a dog moving away. So if you can, selecting the aspects that make it easier for your dog, in addition to distance, can help decrease motivation for your dog to react. And also decreasing duration of exposure. So you say, okay, we're going to go pass by this trigger. My dog's going to do one of their alternative behaviors, and then we're going to book it out of here. We're not going to stay and do like 10 reps because that's going to be too much. So what I wanted to show you is these are the some of the fixes we talked about last week for dogs who have those competing motivations of food and get that thing away from me. And for this week, decrease positive reinforcement for bad behavior. Everything is the same. All of these same things can apply, plus delaying your cue or your food if there is a negative reaction. So even if you're not sure, basically decreasing the proximity and intensity and duration of exposure to triggers is your friend. I do think I have some video that I wanted to show you, but well, yeah, let me show you the video really quickly of some, just in case you're like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm doing this, some really common scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to pause this. So this is Zuma, who is in fact reactive, and she's barking at the neighbor down the street from Melissa. I think just lets their dog out loose in front of the house. So that's what she's barking at. Melissa took one for the team here by basically trying to reward her dog for barking. So here's the first one. So your dog's reacting, and she's going to kind of tug on the leash a little and give a cue, come back over here, and then feed. So that is probably one of the more common ways that we see this. And I've done this many, many times. Here's little Bones, does the bark, and then she does a let's go or a hurry behavior, and then is going to feed. And now you might be saying, well, what am I supposed to do? I would, if you think that you've got the food reinforcing that reactive behavior, I would wait longer, like I said, and keep moving. But you do need to move away. So anytime we're reacting to our dog's problem behavior, we're already in a dicey situation where we might be, because we're reacting, the first thing in the sequence, my dog does this thing I don't like. I call them away. I give them treats. We're already in a situation where we could be reinforcing the behavior we're trying to get rid of. Okay, here is some slightly embarrassing video of myself on our Nest Cam. So Pancake, our newest addition, is on the sofa, and I don't know if this is muted or not. He's going to bark at my husband who's coming into the room. Okay, barky, 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 barky. Now I'm reacting, right? So the problem behavior has happened. Now I'm getting up, calling him over, saying, okay, dude, get in your crate. So I could be here reinforcing the barking with food and attention. I just threw his Kong. He already had his Kong, but I threw his Kong. Oops, sorry about that. I threw his Kong into his crate and I paid attention to him. So both of those things could be functioning as reinforcers for the initial barking. And again, that doesn't mean he's not also barking to make my husband go away. You can have both of those things going on at the same time. Okay, here is another quick example with leash reactivity. That would be the classical conditioning approach, right? She saw the dog, barked, and mom tossed the treats anyway because you're not paying attention to behavior with classical conditioning, but behavior happened and could be reinforced. And the same situation in a home environment. So say you've got a dog who barks at visitors. Your little Bones is going to bark, and then mom's going to give him treats. That would be more the counter conditioning approach. Here's an alternative behavior where she's going to say, oh, move away with me, and reward that. So those were all situations where it's possible, not guaranteed, but it's possible that the food could act as a reinforcer for the behavior you don't want. Okay, I'm going to answer some questions, but also pop up the link to the support group for those of you who aren't in it but want to be. Okay, let's see what we got here. Kelly says, using mostly management with her dog, let's go U-turns, food scatters, and attempting counter conditioning in controlled situations. And Kelly, that probably is a good approach if you're doing the counter conditioning in controlled situations where your dog isn't likely to react, then you're less likely to run into this problem where you're following problem behavior with food. All right, my rescue is always over threshold when on leash, or if she sees another dog from the fence. Recently found out she's semi-feral, so might have started her off wrong when we adopted her in September. I mean, maybe not. Here, actually, I'm gonna put my face back on here if I can figure out how to do it. Okay, I think this way I can put the or actually I might be able to do it with that slide. Let me try. This is new technology for me, so. All right, can you guys see the comment? Okay, so this is a tough one. So if you have a dog who's always over threshold when there is a trigger anywhere in sight, it might, if you're not already working with a good positive reinforcement trainer, then do that. But sometimes these guys are really good candidates for talking with your vet about anti-anxiety medication, because if you can't find any sort of space to train in with triggers, like there's literally no distance and no level of perception of the trigger that your dog doesn't react negatively to, it is really hard to make progress. So that's just something to consider if you do feel like your dog is literally always over threshold. Okay, so if my dog sees another dog from the yard, her hair stands and barks around the fence. Yeah. Well, it's cool that she'll come over for water. Do you have any like even a second or two before she reacts that you might be able to call her before she barks? So sometimes you do have a second or two where you can get in there and just do treats or call your dog away before they do the problem behavior. But you have to really be on your game. For a lot of dogs, it's a very tiny window. Okay. I thought that they're reacting out of emotion. They're not in an operant state of mind. You're not reinforcing the reaction. So Kelly, this is such a great comment. And this is kind of why I wanted to talk about this topic this week, is that there is that belief, and I used to also believe this, that you wouldn't reinforce the reaction. But I've since learned that it can happen. And that, dogs are always learning. They're always learning. There's no such thing. I know you'll read this on a lot of like dog training websites and stuff, but there is no such thing as an operant state of mind. When dogs are really scared, they actually learn via operant conditioning very well. It's not true that a dog who's upset or fearful won't learn through operant conditioning. They learn just fine. If you can imagine, like, I'm trying to think something that would be really scary or painful for us. Say that the classical example of kids who touch the hot burner. That was probably pretty upsetting. It hurt a lot. Operant conditioning is in effect there. Usually most kids only do that once, and then it's been punished quite harshly. So now again, like I said, you only know for sure whether you're reinforcing the reaction or not if the reactive behavior is maintained or goes up. If it goes down, then you weren't reinforcing it. But I just want people to be aware that you can. And I have personally done it multiple times. Okay. Let's see. Most of the time, dog reacts due to surprise encounters. Yeah, those are really the toughest ones. Are the surprise encounters. My current favorite way to deal with this is to train for surprise encounters in controlled situations. So what we will do sometimes with our day training clients, for example, when they're at that advanced stage where the only thing really they react to now are dogs or people, say, appearing around a corner that's pretty close to them, is that we get a helper dog or a helper person and work on that specifically, starting at whatever distance the dog won't react right away. So we have someone who's basically poised to come around a corner that we're approaching. But yeah, the surprise triggers are the hardest for sure. Okay, Joanne says my rescue knows every command, but when someone comes to the door, all listening skills go out the window. She charges and barks at the person at the door. She's a very strong dog. Yes. So this is a little bit of a different topic, and I think we have a video on it. But bridging the gap between what your dog can do when it's easy in the house and what they can do in the presence of, a trigger or something that makes it tougher. Um, one of the hardest things sometimes is finding what to put in between those two situations. Like, well, what can go between nothing going on in the house and a stranger coming to the door? And so, some things you could think about trying would be a known person coming to the door, a known person coming to the door many times in a row. So, it's starting to get boring. Like write one after the other, one time after the other pretty quickly. So they're like, ah, still my dad coming in the house. Um, you could also try having her shut in a room with you away from the door to see if that, if you can get any little bit of the behavior she knows. If she hears the door open, but she's far away, you can always try increased reinforcer value and big prompts like sticking a meatball right under her nose. This is something that a good trainer should be able to help break down for you with your dog. Like experiment on some stuff and give it a try. But yeah, this is kind of like where theory and practice, there's some, when you learn about theory online, this is where the stumbling blocks can be in applying it. You're like, well, I'm doing the thing, but now it's too hard and I don't know what to do. And breaking up those real life scenarios into manageable pieces is what a good trainer can help you with. Ken's asked if there's literature on that. And of course, I don't know exactly when she asked that. Ken's, if you're still on, ask me or put in the comments what piece. I mean, there's literature on just, how reinforcement works for sure, like lots of it. But if you're looking for something really specific, I can try to find it for you. Oh, Michelle, I'm glad that, yeah, it'll be interesting. Just track it. If you make a change, first track behavior without the change for at least several days, and kind of you want some data points to compare to. And then before you make the change, and then make the change for a week or two and see if you get a difference. Now, like I said, because there could be multiple reinforcers in play, that's something just to be aware of. Like if food were the only reinforcer for the problem behavior, then sorry, I lost my train of thought. If food is the only reinforcer and you stop giving it, then you should see a decrease in the reactive behavior. But if food is only one of multiple reinforcers and you still have the, trigger moving away reinforcer going on, then it might be a little tougher to get a change without changing probably distance to the trigger. Ken says literature regarding when operant is still occurring with classical. There's heightened negative emotions we remember better. Yeah, I have also read several things about that, about memory and like sort of single event learning maybe being more effective when we're scared, basically. I don't think there is, let's see, when operant is still occurring. As far as I know, and if someone else knows this in the audience, please jump in. As far as I know, operant conditioning could be happening pretty much always, if the person or animal is conscious and functioning. I'm not sure that there's an emotional state that can make the sort of the processes or rules of operant conditioning obsolete or ineffective. As far as I know, we can always learn by operant conditioning as long as we're properly functioning. But like I said, I'm sure there are people that know more about that than I do out there about the literature. So if you know, please feel free to comment um, and fill us in, and I'll try to do a little digging as well. All right. Any more questions, comments? I was a little worried that people would be upset that that make it sound like I'm telling people not to give treats to dogs who are acting in a way that makes you think that they're fearful, or to not comfort a fearful dog. And this is always kind of a difficult topic because on the one hand, it's true you can't reinforce an emotion as far as anyone knows. You can't reinforce fear. And I definitely comfort my animals when they're upset. um, but you can reinforce behaviors that are associated with fear, and it's just something to be aware of. um I'm not I mean, I love my dogs, and I'm not going to ignore them if they're afraid, for sure. But I am aware that depending on how I choose to respond, there's a possibility that I might be reinforcing behavior I don't like, and I won't know until the future when I see if those behaviors increase. All right, everybody. Well, it was very nice to have so much participation today. I really like to get some comments and hear what's interesting to you, what's not, what you think might be helpful. Next week, I'm not 100% sure. I'm hoping to go through a case study with Pancake, our little dog who's behind. You can see his tan blur behind me. An example of me making some of these mistakes. If I don't have that together, we'll do something else. We've got some material on walking multiple dogs coming up as well. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week. I'll see you online.